Hey, what's up guys? Little man with a big opinion here. Today's video is what gets you put on a list. I recently watched another prepper's video where he talks about 11 items that, makes the government look out for you, kind of, sets off some pings on their radar. And while a lot of the things on his list I agree with, some of it probably 100%, some of it not so much. And then I was gonna add my own stuff to this. The guy's video that I watched, it's DIY Prepper TV. He makes some pretty decent stuff. I like someone that can just turn the camera on, chit chat. He's got good edits. Definitely more of a visual kind of watch. Visual and auditory, whereas mine is, mostly visual. Don't do a whole ton of editing. But before I get into it, you should hit the subscribe button, because that right there is probably going to get you put on a list. And share this with all of your friends and family. The very first thing that I mentioned, watching prepping type content, watching, survivalist type stuff, or, like I pulled this book out, which, I'm not sponsored in any way, but I think it's a pretty good read. The Survivalist Retreat, a total plan for retreat defense. Book came out in 83. I believe the guy was in the military. But, just kind of breaking down the chapters. Why retreat? What's a retreat? Practical designs. What are you trying to protect? Getting there. Who's the enemy? Arsenal defense. Things beyond your firepower. Making it difficult. What if it comes to a fight? And then I really like on page 117, or it goes 117 to 125, the defensible retreat checklist. And this is one of those kind of things that, very useful tool. Even if you don't buy the book, you can find PDF versions, and, I would definitely snipe the checklist. Things like, can the area be patrolled? Will the retreat, like the very first thing on here, will the retreat hold all of the people who are likely to use it? Water, preserving food. Have I devised a workable defense plan? There's like about 4.5 pages that go into it. But I think stuff like that gets you put on a list. I think we have, lists for just about everything. And there's probably lists of lists, and, I don't remember what goes above terabyte, but, there's probably terabytes of data out there on, the different sort of people. Kind of reminds me of, I don't remember which, I think it was the Captain America movie where he's trying to take down S.H.I.E.L.D. because they're, planning on pre-taking people out based on data that, this algorithm basically assumes you are eventually going to commit a crime. You are eventually going to cause a problem. And they want to take Captain America out because, he meets the criteria for this. and the guy running it, Nick Fury, is on there as well. Um, but that's kind of what this stuff is for. And when they catch bad guys, we're super happy about it. And you know, when they ensnare innocent people, it kind of goes along with Ben Franklin said. You know, I would rather one guilty man walk free than 10 innocent people, uh, be harmed, or something along those lines. You can't charge someone for a crime that they haven't, committed. It's kind of like, the last scenario. Are you going to go back in time and kill baby Hitler? Stuff to think about. So, watching this channel, buying books, taking classes, doing the type of stuff that is going to make you more of a, survivalist, a prepper, an asset, things like that. Our government definitely probably looks into those kind of people. I remember, the instructor I had in RFTC for college, he was explaining the hierarchy of like how the U.S. military, if it came down to we need as many people to join the military as possible, you start with active, then you're nationalizing National Guards, and then I don't remember if it was state guards next or, people that had been out for 4 years or less. But eventually you get on down the list that before they just, start asking everyday civilians, join the military, we'll turn you into a soldier. Eagle Scouts were on the list because, you'd already been taught how to march, basic military stuff. You've been a part of a hierarchy. Your senior patrol leader is kind of like a patrol leader, or an NCO. And so, they're probably looking at you from that standpoint. Going into other stuff that you purchase. And the very first thing he had on his list was the lockpick. It's one of those kind of things that, owning the lockpick isn't going to get you in trouble. It's, your intentions with it, which, that works for everything. I'm drinking out of a smaller one, but, here's a nice big old tumbler. If I use it for its intended purpose, which is to hold liquids and keep them hot and cold so I can consume it, there's nothing wrong with that. If I randomly decided to bash someone's head in with it, there's probably, lawyers out there that would argue that it was used as a bludgeoning device. So it works the same way with a lockpick. If I'm parked in my driveway, you can't really see what I'm doing. I lock my keys in the truck, and I can pick the lock and get it open. I'm not waiting for the police to show up. I'm not paying a locksmith a whole bunch of money to basically do the same thing. There's nothing wrong with that. You do it in a Walmart parking lot, someone's probably going to see something and say something, and you might have to explain to the cops, yes, I am the owner of this vehicle. It's going to take longer. And then obviously, it's midnight. If I'm out doing something at midnight, darkness shows that you're trying to hide something, or the possibility of trying to hide something. So, it could be perceived as a problem. And then obviously if you're trying to get into something that you don't own, that you shouldn't be getting into, that's a problem. Owning the lockpicking set, societal collapse, it's The Walking Dead and you're trying to break into something. Uh, if it is uninhabited and there's stuff in there and society has collapsed, that's a completely different story. Uh, you deal with the risk of someone possibly, still claims that as their own, and that's its own set of issues. Uh, but buying a lockpick set might put you on a list. The second thing, which I'd never heard of, it's called a flipper device, and the specific brand flipper device I hadn't heard of, but I had heard of people that made something that they could scan frequencies and open stuff that's on that bandwidth. Typically involves vehicles, garage openers, uh, you know stuff of that nature. And that one's a little bit more precarious. He mentions in the video, you lock your keys in the vehicle. uh your garage door opener is not working. He does mention, you figuring out the frequency of your stuff, and the device tells you, what has opened different things. So if you notice your garage door, you know, more than one device is opening it, then, you might have discovered a issue. But basically anything else that you're using it for, probably a nefarious, some sort of thing. In a prepping grid down scenario, I don't see a massive usage for it. I mean, yes, you can get into a locked vehicle. If it's fancy enough that it has push to start, it'll register, and, you could use that vehicle. But I'm probably not going to purchase one unless I just had endless money sitting around. So you got that going for you. He also mentioned bolt cutters. People have used them for nefarious reasons. If it's the middle of the night, there's reports of break-ins, you're driving your car slowly through the neighborhood, and you got bolt cutters sitting in your passenger seat, they're probably going to say something. If you have a whole truck bed full of tools and it says construction company on the side, they're probably not going to say something. That's just a general tool. I personally, that's one of those things that I put much, much lower on the list. That one just might get a couple of questions from law enforcement if you're ever stopped. But, it was on the list, so we'll add it and we'll talk about it. I think the biggest thing, which, in my opinion, we're probably on list for ammunition and firearms. We have to submit, ID, fill out paperwork, the VIN numbers on it is registered to it, or serial number, VINs, vehicles. But, there are hundreds of millions of firearms in the U.S. There are tens upon tens of millions of people that own them. It's a device. You're using it for self-defense, hunting, prepping, whatever. There's probably a generalized list of here's everyone that owns firearms, and here's the ones, that they have purchased, from an FFL dealer. Probably why the government doesn't like the idea of ghost guns or private sales. But, that massive list is probably much harder to narrow down on this person is, risky. There's a lot more other factors that go into that one. buying copious amounts of ammo. Um, I would love to bulk buy ammo online, but that probably puts you on a list. Buying ammo, from Academy, local gun store, a lot of places, you don't have to, say this person bought 500 rounds of 9mm. This person bought, a box of shotgun shells. And, I think that's how it should be. I think California and, some of the more liberal leaning states have made it a requirement that FFL dealers, have to document ammo that people have purchased. So there's a list out there for that. If you're buying yourself at a gun show, with cash, or if you're buying it with cash in general, uh, they probably don't know how much you have. If you're buying it with a debit or a credit card, that might put you on a list. So, that's kind of up to you. And, the next thing that goes on there is, reloading supplies. That's another one of those things that, each shell casing and bullet and primer isn't serialized. I've shown off the reloading stuff that I got from my grandpa, and he's made some of these rounds, in the early 90s. I have, bullets and casings and primers and stuff that, no one other than my friends or family know that what I have. And even I kind of don't know what I have. So that goes into, you buy a bunch of this stuff, you're probably going on a list somewhere. A lot of this kind of delves into the realm of, if these people are self-reliant, then that means they're not relying on us, and this could be a problem. So, the next things is, solar, wind, anything that you can generate, your own energy without being tied to a utility grid, probably puts you on a list. Buying the stuff for, a rain harvest collection system, putting in any sort of like well, or stuff that can purify water. Like, let me go show you something real quick. I picked these up this month. These are replacement filters for the Berkey water system. I don't own a Berkey. I bought 2 8-quart stainless steel pots. Most of the hardware today, I've got to order a spigot online, or I might go to Lowe's. Probably go to Lowe's because I'm a instant gratification kind of person. This is one of those things. These are like $30. I've got to get it off of Amazon. I could probably get it in a major city like, Dallas, Austin, Houston. But that's driving, 3-4 plus hours in one direction. That might not necessarily get you put on a list. But something that I didn't mention in the beginning that I should probably mention now is, you're put on these different lists. Let's say, the likelihood of this person being an issue is 2% because they bought water filters. Well, we see that they bought water filters and 500 rounds of 9mm. The 500 rounds of 9mm, makes you go up 4%. But, those two things in conjunction, doesn't equal 6%, it equals, 9%. So, again, that's where, doing all of this stuff together might, make them jot your stuff down. Bulk food purchase, especially more leaning on the side of long-term bulk food purchase, you know, buying Mountain House, Ready Weiss, you know, freeze dried kind of stuff, or MREs, or like we own a Harvest Right freeze dryer. That wasn't on his list, but that makes you more self reliant because instead of buying a Mountain House meal for $10 a piece, I can put my SpaghettiOs in there and freeze dry them. They'll last 25 plus years. And, you know, the meal, you know, the one can is $1.08. Like I bought them today. Because this weekend I'm gonna freeze dry SpaghettiOs because I like SpaghettiOs. They're a comfort item. Uh, you know, I went and picked up 12 cans. And I was surprised, you know, I got the meatballs, so 17 grams of protein, bunch of carbs, bunch of sodium. You know, probably not the healthiest thing to eat, but you know, it's adding calories. And every little bit helps. So I cleaned up the freeze dryer. That'll be a video that comes out at some point, where I'll go through the process of making that food. But you know, if you're someone that, you know, we've wanted to buy, you know, a quarter or half, don't have the freezer capacity to do a full cow, but you know, buying your meat like that, where you're covering, you know, your protein requirement for a massive extended amount of time, probably gonna get you put on a list. I think I've said you're going on a list enough. So we'll just kind of, you know, go through other things. I didn't mention, you know, just a good old plain generator before. That's kind of lumped in the energy side of things. You know, you also have anything to do with NBC or nuclear, biological, chemical, you know, gas mask, hazmat suits, you know, anything that involves decontamination. That's a level of prepping that, like, I own a gas mask. You know, I went through, you know, CS when I was in the army, and it sucks. You know, that's like the weakest thing that you might deal with, and that kind of puts you on a prepping level of, you know, I'm planning for fallout to happen. And you know, I don't have, you know, hazmat suits or stuff to, you know, do serious decontamination. While I see that as a possibility, you know, I'm more focused on, you know, other things at the moment. If more money materializes, you know, it is on a list. It will get purchased at some point. But that's one of those things that, you know, if you really think that's going to be the problem, then you've purchased it, or you've made it through more of the list, so you've purchased it. That's a big, serious problem. And, you know, probably gonna, you know, get stuff jotted down for you on that. Military surplus. You know, that's just, you know, he rattled off, you know, several things that could fall in this category. So this will be one of the last things. Actually, I'll put communication in there first. You know, I've got ham radio stuff. Grandpa was a ham radio operator. I need to take my test. But, you know, communication in general. I've got a Baofeng that's like the cheapest entry level of communication. Then there's all the ham radio stuff, you know, anything that will make it easier for you to communicate with anyone, you know, write that down. But then, you know, military surplus. that covers a wide swath of almost anything and everything. I will say this: military surplus just means it meets, you know, the minimum standard that they put for this object at, the cheapest bid option. Some military stuff I think is awesome. I bought a light fighter tent. It's a good one person tent, fairly lightweight. It's not the most lightweight thing in the world, compared to some of the, backpacking tents that they have out there. But it's camouflage. It's got, I can't think of the word right. It's got the spray stuff on it that, helps keep bugs away, especially if you keep up with it and, recoat it when you're supposed to. Uh, and it compresses down into a fairly small, sack. If you don't have one, I would recommend getting one. Check your Facebook Marketplace. A lot of people that get out of the military don't hold on to it because, they're not camping kind of people. And you can get them real. I think I got mine for $80. They're listed anywhere between 75 and about 250. The tent brand new is about a $450 tent. Like if you're buying it, from that sort of supplier. But military surplus in general, buying older uniforms, plate carriers, ACHs, the list goes on and on and on. Even like the simplest idea of you can buy glow stick at Walmart. They're in the camping section. They're useful, you hang them on, guidelines from your tent so people don't trip on them. They provide, kind of like a nightlight. Some of them are better than others. Uh, Military ones are going to last a certain amount of time. And it's just, you put the word military on there and people think it's the coolest thing in the world. That might get you, jot it down. So that category covers anything and everything. I own several military sleeping bags. I also own, I've got a backpacking sleeping bag, that goes down into, don't really have anything sitting here that represents the size very well. Relatively small. It weighs a couple of pounds. It compresses much smaller than the military one. But the military one is a, OD green, natural color. This sleeping bag is, about the orange color of my protein powder. Very bright and vibrant. That one is more likely to get torn up if I was being really, really aggressive with it. The way they do the stitching on the Army one, much, much better. It can be beat up more. And, the military one, it's got buttons and zippers that you can, I've got the patrol bag that goes inside the bigger green one. And, infinitely gets a better rating. And then it can go inside of a black one. Then it can also go inside of a bivy cover. It's basically a tarp that buttons up to your sleeping bag. So if you didn't set up, any sort of shelter or tent, it's going to keep you dry. And the bivy cover is made, it can button into any part of that system. And, it's the bivy cover I have is like a woodland camo one. But military surplus stuff in general, might get stuff written down. And so ways to avoid this, buy stuff in cash. I have bought plenty of backpacking, camping, survivalist kind of stuff that goes into my preps, from garage sales, thrift stores, you know, paid for it in cash. Some of this stuff you're not going to find there. You know, you've got to buy it online. Uh, you know, depending on where you live, they might have a problem with it. Like, certain states don't let you buy body armor. I think that's dumb. Glad I don't live there. Uh, but it's one of those things that probably why they want to get rid of cash, because they can't track it. Uh, you know, they added the, you know, reporting, you know, side hustle money over $600, that kind of stuff. And so, you know, I think I'm on a list somewhere. I think I've made enough videos. I think I've bought enough stuff that they're like, you know, we're gonna double check and make sure nothing nefarious is going on here. And, you know, that's why we do this, because one of the prepping scenarios could be dealing with a, you know, a despot government. You know, we all draw our lines in the sand on, you know, how much we're going to take, you know, what is going to initiate the plan that I've set up. And, you know, someone coming to take my stuff, there's a line in the sand there. You know, you get this stuff to be able to take care of, you know, your family, your friends, your mutual assistance group, staying as close to normal as you can. And so, you know, I got those water filters. I got most of the hardware. I'm going to make my own little Berkey system. That way I know I can collect rainwater, run it through the system, and we can drink it. If that gets me put on a list, so be it. You know, if someone shows up and they're like, hey, we need that thing, they better be prepared to trade for it. Otherwise, you know, we have other prepping items that make sure that I keep my prepping items, if you catch my drift. But we've gone, you know, over half an hour. In the comment section down below, add anything else that you want to add. Just know if you're adding something, they might be adding you to that list. Subscribe to the channel. That might get you put on the list. But, you know, that's how we grow. And share this with all of your friends and family. That's going to get you added. That's going to get them added because they watched it. And, you know, if every single person is on the list, then I guess that means no one's on the list. Is that how that logic works out? But all that being said, I'll catch you on the next one.